So thank you very much. I think we're ready to start the second half of this panel on affordability or ability to pay. One thing I've been reminded to tell everybody is that there is a happy hour immediately after this. So if you want to sit around and talk more about affordability policy choices with our esteemed panelists, they will be around. You could share wine or beer or maybe something else, I don't know, with them. So we are pivoting here to talk about international context. So allow me to introduce the panelists here. So to my left is Catherine Dixon. Catherine is the CEO of the Regulatory Assistance Project. Prior to RAP, she led Bain & Company's Energy Transition Policy Center. And before that was Energy Transition Chief Counselor at the International Energy Agency. And started her career as a British diplomat, and also was on a very nice panel yesterday on heat pumps. So nice to have you here, Catherine. Ana Maria Carreño is the Senior Director for Climate at CLASP. Ana Maria joined CLASP in 2011 and has been there ever since. Also leads the Clean Lighting Coalition, which offers strategic guidance on international engagement in the effort to phase out mercury-containing lamps like the aforementioned CFLs. Jacqueline Okeu is the founder and CEO of Nzani Clean Energy Capital, which is a startup fund that is partnering with affordable housing landlords to catalyze investments in utility infrastructure projects that are especially focused at low to moderate income households in affordable housing in Africa. Over 16 years of experience in real estate development and building decarbonization policy in South Africa and the United States. And she also consults for NYSERDA here in New York. And finally, Heather Thompson is the CEO at the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. She previously was co-founder and vice president of programs for ClimateWorks and a principal at CEA, where she led the firm's work in philanthropic strategy. So please join me in welcoming the panel. So as you can tell from those job descriptions, we have a very diverse set of people working on a number of different technology areas in a number of different geographies around the world. This is obviously going to be sort of a broader ranging conversation than the first one. But one common theme I think that we're going to hear is that they're all working on strategies to make clean energy more affordable and more accessible throughout the world for a number of different clean energy technologies. So I would like to start just by asking you all to share a bit about the work you do and sort of how you've noticed, whether you've noticed affordability becoming a more central component of your work over this year. Maybe we'll start with you, Kathleen.
Yeah, well, RAP is an international organisation working at quite a few different markets, so affordability has definitely become something that's risen up the agenda a lot over the last period, but probably the market that inevitably that I know best is, the European market. And I think people here will all be familiar with the gas price spikes that have really driven energy prices, or electricity prices very high in Europe over the last few years. But I mean, really, there's a big structural issue for Europe with, I think our electricity prices are now, they've come down, but they're still double what they are in the US and 50% higher than China. And of course, this isn't just an issue for, retail prices. I mean, these are industrial prices, I should say. It's really an issue that cuts to the heart of industrial competitiveness for Europe and, where Europe's place is in the world. Because for those of us that work on energy, you'll know that energy is the only real universal currency, and the route to industrial competitiveness and a strong economy is affordable electricity. And so it's driving quite a big polarization in Europe, I think, between those that, would say that we need to meet our climate goals, at all costs to our competitiveness, and those that think we need to, to drive economic competitiveness, whatever it means for climate. And of course, the challenge for a community that we work in as RAP is to try to demonstrate this is a false choice. 80% of, I don't know if people realize, 80% of US LNG exports end up in the European market. This is, there is no route to a competitive Europe that goes through gas. It creates structurally higher costs for Europe if we rely on gas. So the challenge for Europe really is to drive affordability in electricity markets. But of course, there are big debates within my organisation about that, what that means because of course, what does affordability really mean? Are we talking low prices? Are we talking low costs? And those are a little bit different issues and create big debates in RAP.
All right, I'll start by introducing CLASP. We're a global NGO working on appliance efficiency for climate mitigation and to improve lives of millions of people around the world through energy access. And affordable, efficient appliances are at the core of what we do, but it's also at the core of the policymakers that we work with. They are really concerned about the impacts of policies on consumers. So in general, that's part of what we do, try to design policies that are going to maximize efficiency of appliances while being affordable for consumers. But I have to say, what I have noticed recently, over the recent years, is a concern about impacts on low-income households across the world as well. And maybe just to put an example, in the Global South, we're looking at millions of people that don't have access to critical appliances for cooling, for refrigeration as well. So affordability, the first cost of getting that appliance is a major concern. And I think, as we heard today in the previous panel, in many countries in the developing world, the concern is about paying the energy bill, especially in critical months during summer and critical months during winter, where households are making trade-offs on where they are paying the energy bill or whether they are purchasing food as well. But I think at the end of the day, at the core, we have to design smart policies that are going to drive efficiency up, that are going to bring appliances accessible and affordable. And I think that's what we will be discussing today.
Great, thank you. Jackie?
How's my audio? It's good? Thank you so much for the introduction, and great to be here with you all today. I think you've summarized it nicely in terms of what Mzansi Clean Energy Capital does. We are an emerging impact infrastructure fund that is partnering with large affordable housing landlords in South Africa to catalyze investments in clean utility projects that are targeted at low to moderate income households. And also, I'm here today also in my capacity as a representative for the Global Buildings Performance Network. Together with the GBPN, we are figuring out ways in which we can collaborate to collect more project evidence, and that can help to drive affordable housing decarbonization across the African continent through the work that we're doing. So, from the work that I've done also here in the US, looking at some of the similarities and between the US market and Africa, firstly has to do with the presence of naturally occurring affordable housing. So this is housing that is not necessarily falling under public housing authorities or falling under housing agencies that were landlords who are actually receiving some sort of subsidies from housing agencies that are state or federally funded. These types of housing, which we call the naturally occurring affordable housing, are very prevalent in the market, and so it becomes very, very difficult to actually track any clean energy program incentives that are being directed to this market. So there's no form of guaranteeing affordability for end users or what is really happening in this sort of unknown. The other similarity would be the presence of the capacity of low to moderate income landlords to actually scope out more clean energy projects. They just want to focus only on their core business, their bread and butter, which is bricks and mortar. Yeah, they don't really want to have any complex discussions around structuring renewable energy projects or collecting energy audits so they can qualify for certain programs, and also so they are also resource constrained, so you really have to go in there and work with them to actually build pipeline to be able to scope out some of these projects. But on the flip side, just a quick overview of where we are seeing so I focused on similarities. Where we are seeing differences is here in the US, the presence of a strong coordinating central authority. We've heard a little bit about the PSC doing good work. NYSERDA collaborates closely with the PSC. In Africa, you have authorities, you have utility authorities, but they don't really have that coordinating power where they are sectorally focused. So that has created a big gap in the market where no one is really looking at sectorally from a building perspective. No one is really looking at building codes and standards. No one is looking at green workforce developments in the building sector. No one is looking at utilities coordination in the building sector. So there's no decarbonization roadmap for the sector, which is where the GBPN has seen a big opportunity.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more actually in a minute about some of the other differences between the US and other countries. But first, Kathleen, sorry, Heather.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. So I think we were even referenced in the earlier panel because there was a lot of talk on transportation and electric vehicles. So ITDP not only predominantly works in the Global South, we only work in the Global South. We have worked in the U.S. at one point, but no longer. So we are really focused on affordability. This year is our 40th year anniversary, and environmental issues and equity has been at the core of our mission since the start. So where we work, you know, it was already referenced that transportation is often the second most. It is sometimes the first most expensive cost to households in the world. So focusing on transportation is not only about affordability, it's also about access to jobs, to healthcare, to schools, to everything that we do. And we talk a lot about cars here in the US, but in most places in the world, people walk. Walking is the most common form of transportation in the world, followed by buses. So ITDP is very known for their obsession with buses, but there's a good reason for it. It is because most people in the world get around on buses, and that is because they're affordable. But most of those buses are hand-me-down, used buses that come from other economies. You see, you know, what we would call a minivan here in the US operating as a minibus taxi with, you know, 12, 15 people in it. And that is a very common form of transportation. So we're all about focusing on improvements, not just to vehicles, but also to the urban landscape with more compact development, walking, cycling, a preference for public transportation, which can save us a lot of money and households a lot of money. And I can say more about that, but that's where affordability and ITDP come together.
Great. Several of you sort of touched on some of the differences with the US, but just given that we just had a US-centric panel, are there any other important differences that we should keep in mind for the rest of this discussion when we're talking about strategies or policies or sort of structures in some of the countries where you work versus in the US? I'll open that up to anybody. Moot.
I guess it's a kind of US difference, but I think it's more of an international difference, and I think there are huge differences if you're thinking about at least the power sector between economies that have market designs which are fundamentally liberal, you know, where we use pricing, you know, really to drive decisions about investment and assets and resources, and those which are vertically integrated, you know, where we've basically got, you know, either the government or, you know, somehow regulated utilities. And I think that does create a real issue. I do worry that, you know, in economies where we've got basically utilities that are paid for the number of, you know, for the assets they build, we call it CapEx plus models. You know, you have regulators, you know, and this is very common in the US, you know, regulating prices, and then you have utilities paid for the assets they build plus some, you know, profit margin. Fundamentally, you get an incentive from regulators, from utilities to build. And of course, in the new world of, you know, flexibility, where we've got EVs, you know, we've got heat pumps all on the demand side, and we've got variable renewables on the supply side. What we want to create is price signals that mean that people, you know, shift their load to different times of the day, you know, or they maybe use less when the prices are really high. And I don't know how it, you know, there are lots of mechanisms that people try to use to create incentives for utilities not to build, you know, or to do performance-based regulation. But fundamentally, if you're in an CapEx plus model, you know, it's quite hard to kind of encourage, you know, utilities not to build, to use non-wires alternatives and demand-side response systems.
Maybe to expand on the discussion earlier, we talk about some of the affordability challenges that are common across the world, and I think I mentioned in the sector, in the appliance sector, We're talking about that barrier, the first cost for many users that are purchasing an appliance for the first time, especially in the global south. And maybe to illustrate that point, we did a research on access on cooling in Latin America. And what we found is that the price of getting an air conditioner and small air conditioner for the first time sometimes is equal or even 1.5 higher the average monthly income of a household. So that just tells you exactly how these appliances are out of reach for many households. And then in the US, for instance, we heard from many of the panelists earlier, the low income households, what is the energy burden? ACEEE, our partners at ACEEE quantify this at 10%. They spend 10% of their income on paying their energy bill. So I think if you do that math for you, you can tell how costly it is, what are the trade-offs that you will do sometimes. In the UK as well, we have been talking about the UK. There was a study by one advocacy group that talked about renters in the UK. 40% of renters have to ration heating during winter as well, because either they pay the energy bill or they purchase food as well. So I think, those are the major challenges that we're trying to address here by making equipment more efficient, which means more affordable in the long term. Interventions for covering that barrier of the first price costs are going to be different as well, because that means, creating financing mechanisms for consumers that are going to be purchasing that equipment for the first time, giving, opportunities to pay maybe on bill or to pay, in the long term.
Great. Yeah, I'd actually love to talk more about accessibility in a second as well. I don't know if either of you have anything additional to add here.
Maybe just a quick point to highlight. That electricity is actually, for low to moderate incomes, it's prepaid, not postpaid, like we have here in the US. And then also across the African continent, only 12 countries have regulated building codes. So the rest of the other countries, there's no real regulation around building codes. And I think only about 3 countries actually have a decarbonization roadmap for their building sector.
So I do, like I said, I want to talk a little bit about accessibility here. That we talked about that a bit in the first panel, but I think it's important here too. Heather, maybe starting with you, when you think about public transportation systems, electric buses, that's obviously a more affordable option for many people than owning a private vehicle. It still costs the city quite a bit to build the infrastructure and to buy the fleet. How are you seeing those costs change? What are some of the ways? I mean, I'll say that that's a problem. Even I'm Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, we're having a big problem right now where the state government has cut off some public funding, and they might be reducing service for some of our bus services and other things. So how is that? How are you dealing with that throughout the world?
So that is a common problem, and a place where a quandary we hear often, where we have a lot of public transport. Cities are making the choice between having more transport or investing in electrification, which is expensive, and it's just a terrible decision for cities to be in. And I think a lot of cities in the US and Europe and elsewhere are really grappling with that decision. But back to the Global South, we've done some studies at ITDP called the Compact City Electrified Studies. We did a global study and we did some country-based studies, and they're really wonderful because they provide a lot of big picture messages, but also some really specific details with targets on what we need in terms of investment in public transportation and walking and cycling infrastructure as well. And that study showed that if we invest in compact city development, so not just the transportation, but also the infrastructure, along with walking and cycling and public transportation, we can save globally $5 trillion by 2050 and save energy demand, lower energy demand by 40%. So this is huge, and those cost savings not only come to the country in terms of trillions of dollars, but also to households in saving either a third or up to 50% of their expenses on transportation. So it's a huge savings. But as you mentioned, if we want to invest in that infrastructure, countries need the money, cities need the money, and specifically on the issue of electrification, as we mentioned, the upfront cost of the vehicles is higher. Over the lifetime of the over the lifetime of the vehicles, consumers, cities, governments will save money, but it's really, but the challenge is having enough money to purchase the more expensive vehicle up front. So there are a lot of mechanisms that are coming into place to help bring down the cost and finance those vehicles. Some of those are more public sector mechanisms, some of them are private sector mechanisms, and there's great opportunities to study those and share them and replicate them around the world. One that's really interesting that we're seeing in Ethiopia, for example, in Ethiopia recently, because of energy security reasons, they have decided to ban the import of conventional vehicles, which is actually working very well for their people because they already have cheap renewable energy, so the energy prices work so that an electric vehicle is cheaper to the consumer as they're driving it, and they can use that savings to pay back a lease that is essentially provided to them as they purchase the vehicle. And instead of paying it back as we do on a monthly basis, you can pay it back on a daily basis or a weekly basis, as was referenced earlier. So it makes it a much easier transaction for a driver who has a better vehicle and is at the end of the day making more money. The same can be done at the larger scale with governments, city governments, where essentially it's the same thing with buses. Cities are buying buses, but rather than paying the upfront capital cost, they're paying that cost over the lifetime of the battery. So there's new business models that are essentially changing the way you can pay for things, but the challenge is that we need entities that can put that capital together and provide that upfront capital. And we're seeing a lot more private sector players that have come from the energy sector are seeing that the energy sector is saturated and looking for new investment opportunities. So there's ways of taking these business models and pulling them together and creating these interesting finance structures that are often these public-private ventures that are catching on and being replicated.
That's very exciting. Jacqueline, your whole model is based on accessibility, but maybe you could say a few more words about sort of exactly how your model works and whether it's scalable in other countries. Sorry about that.
Sure. So maybe just to give some context in terms of the fund and how we came about with the fund. So we've been working on the fund concept for about 4 years. We started with the fund concept about 4 years ago. And some 2 years back, we decided to submit it to the Climate Policy Initiative's Global Innovation Lab for climate finance. And so we were selected as winners of the Eastern and Southern Africa region with our instrument. That program focuses on really incubating early stage innovative climate finance instruments. So we've been participating in that program for the past 2 years, and we've benefited from the network of institutional investors and donors and philanthropies that sit within that network to help us position the fund and to also validate the mechanism of the fund. So the way the fund itself works, it's a blended financing vehicle that is mobilizing both concessionary capital, so from various public sources, alongside commercial capital and investing that capital as subordinated debt, coupled with some credit enhancements into investing that capital as into portfolio utility SPVs that are set up to provide discounted clean utility services to low to moderate income tenants. And the tenants are in buildings that are owned by affordable housing landlords. And in turn, the landlords who own these buildings sign long-term offtake agreements with our fund. The fund itself is supported by our unique technical assistance offering, and that technical assistance offering serves two main purposes. The first one is to work with landlords to build their capacity to scope out more clean utility projects. And the second one is to work with tenants to help them to improve their climate resilience and also to improve their household utility management. So where we are at this stage, we have moved from fund concept design. We finished that process last year and the instrument got endorsed through the CPI summit. We are now at fund operationalization. where we are busy now with a pipeline that we have assembled. So the fund itself targets about 28,000 housing units over its life, over 15 years. We mobilized a pipeline of about 8,000 housing units. This is just starting off in South Africa, and this is from our pipeline of our network of landlords. There were 2 landlords who we invited into that working group that we coordinated with the lab program. And so we are now heavily investing in the development of this pipeline, looking at things like doing project ESG accreditation for that pipeline, engaging the Development Bank of South Africa around project preparation funding for this pipeline. So that's where we are with that. And then we are also engaging a technology and EPC partner. We want to strike up a longer-term partnership with this technology and EPC partner, and they'll also come on board and help us interpret some of the utility data. And then finally, just a last piece to highlight, we are also now working with a global law firm that is helping us with the legal structuring of the fund, because we will be because it's a blended financing structure, we have to manage the economic interests of different classes of investors. So it can become very complex very quickly. And so they're helping us figure this out. And we've also been deliberate to move away from what are called the standard power purchase agreements. We don't think these are suitable for this market at all. So we've opted for more flexible offtake agreements. And this is exactly why we are mobilizing concessionary capital to provide credit enhancements for landlords. We don't think landlords should be sitting with offtake risks, which is currently how the standard PPA agreements are structured.
And do you see this as a model that can be replicated in other countries as well?
Absolutely. And so that's why we've started off with the market of, this was a big conversation that we had in the lab. They were very much about, is this only a South Africa model? How do you scale this across the continent where you don't have much of affordable housing market pretty much set up the way it is set up in South Africa? And so we really had to look at how we can work even outside of affordable housing landlords, how we can work with other landlords like retail landlords who have presence in disadvantaged communities where lots of low to moderate income households exist. So absolutely, model scale is scalable across the Global South, which is the purpose really of that climate policy initiative program.
That's great.
Yeah.
Anna, I know CLASP has worked on a pilot project in the UK to bring electric cooking to people living in social housing. And there was a challenge there as far as not being able to afford the upfront costs. But are there any lessons, can you describe that pilot a little bit? And then are there any lessons that you take from that experience that you're going to apply elsewhere?
Yeah. So for some background, as you mentioned, this was done in Manchester. It was a retrofit project in social housing units. And what we did is we replaced gas stoves with more efficient cook stoves and ovens as well. In the UK, about 50% of households still cook with gas, and I think the challenge is cost prohibitive, especially for low-income households, to purchase induction stoves as well. So what we really were trying to do is show feasibility, and then some lessons learned from that retrofit as well. And I think, first of all, we wanted to create awareness on the benefits of cooking with gas, and I think that was very effective. We showed that there is reduced indoor pollution, we showed that it's easier to use, we showed that it's easier to use for people that have reduced mobility as well. The households itself were telling us, this is, they prefer the new appliance, very easy to use, and of course, understanding of, the health risk associated with using gas, the indoor pollution, the higher NOx, which meant reduce asthma episodes as well in some of these households. The second thing is we wanted to raise awareness with UK policymakers because there's already pilots, retrofitting pilots that are taking place for social units, but they didn't consider gas cooking. So we wanted to talk about, the opportunity to include gas cooking, replacing of gas cooking with electric stoves in these retrofit projects, and talk about, of course, the heating costs of cooking with gas as well, that, as I mentioned, has associated health risks. In the UK, about 4,000 premature deaths related to using gas in the household as well. So there are a lot of benefits for the government as well in terms of national expenditure in investing in this type of project. And then we also wanted to quantify what does this mean for households as well. And what we learned is that cooking with gas in the long term is more expensive. There's a 15-year time frame for gas stoves and electric stoves as well. And overall, the total cost of ownership, so for purchasing and using a gas stove, is higher than an electric stove as well. So I think we wanted to show again, this is affordable if you consider the total ownership, the total cost of ownership.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in the previous panel, but I do wish that more people experienced cooking on induction stoves. It's really very nice. It's not like electric resistance heating, which is not great, but cooking on induction stoves is really great. Let's stay in the UK, Catherine. And you mentioned up front that in Europe, many households, the electricity prices that they face are taxed in a way that's sort of more burdensome than the gas prices that they face. Can you describe a little bit how RAP is thinking about this issue and what we can do to change that dynamic? And I assume that obviously ends up being a barrier to electrification and decarbonization.
Yeah, and I think there are two issues here. So I think the first one is that, it is true that we end up with quite a lot of, governments have ended up loading quite a lot of taxes and levies onto electricity, that don't really exist on fossil fuels in the same way. So, of course, all the efficiency advantages that you get with a heat pump, which uses, 1 unit of energy compared to 4 from a gas boiler, or, you think of an EV, much more efficient use of energy than, burning petrol in a car. A lot of those are eroded from a price perspective because governments have put quite a lot of taxes and levies on electricity bills, which, just does not give sort of consumers an incentive to switch. So we're doing what we can to kind of persuade governments to really try to drive those. I mean, that's a taxation issue, isn't it? To try to drive that taxation into other areas. And I think there's also there's legacy costs as well, which are the legacy costs of some of the early renewables development. We had quite high feed-in tariffs in Europe in order to get the renewables market going, and some of those legacy costs remain on electricity bills. And I think the challenge here, I talked earlier about pricing and costs, is that there's a big pressure, I think, to reduce electricity prices in Europe, and that pressure is right. We need it for retailers. We also, retail customers. We also need it for industrial customers, as I said, for industrial competitiveness. But the issue is then that you get quite a lot of pressure to subsidise electricity, and the subsidies that we've seen in Europe are pretty popular. But the problem is that when you start subsidising prices, you don't necessarily end up with the price signals that you need in order to drive down costs in the long term. So it's the price signals that tell you, when to charge, when to heat your home, where and when to build, new generation, what to store. And if you remove price signals, then, we won't get the kind of system, a low-cost system, that we need to drive down prices in the long run. So there's a sort of short and long run issue really where pricing is concerned, because in order to drive down prices in the long run, we need low costs, and that means limiting the amount of grid that we build. There's a lot of focus on grid build out right now, but really the cheapest grid that we build is the grid that we don't build. And we do that when we allow companies, and we've got in the UK, we've got a company called Octopus, which some people might be familiar with, basically leasing EVs to people and then controlling those EVs and selling back the electricity that wasn't used, or the electricity that it's stored, into wholesale markets, massively reducing the cost of running the EV and also providing a grid service. But they can only do that, of course, if they've got good price signals that mean that, they're exposed to, high electricity prices, peak electricity prices, that allow them to sort of, generate income at that point. And also they're only, able to do that, of course, if regulation allows it. And in many places in Europe, you can only really bid into a wholesale market if you're a 1 gigawatt resource, which typically looks like a gas plant. So I think we have to be a bit careful when we're talking about lowering prices as to what we really mean, because what we don't want to do is end up, lowering prices in the short term and then end up with structurally higher costs in the long run, which, even if they're not on people's electricity bills, they'll come through general taxation, or they'll come through the fact that we don't build the grid that we needed. And so, and that will be harmful for, productivity and competitiveness in the long run. Impacting on jobs and prosperity. So I think we have to take a wider perspective on some of these issues.
That question about the short-term versus long-term costs, I think, is a really important one. There's obviously a lot of pressure on policymakers, especially when people are beginning to complain about costs and beginning to feel the pinch to do something about prices and about costs now, today, not worrying necessarily about what that might mean 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line. I'll just wonder if anyone else has anything to say about that. I do think that's like a major challenge. But
I'll maybe jump in on that. And, I referenced the example of Ethiopia earlier, where the country has decided to ban the imports of conventional vehicles. And it's because they have a lot of renewable energy and they don't want to import costly fuels. But then if we look at a country like Indonesia really wants to meet the needs of its people with public transportation, and they have committed to fully electrifying their fleet. We've helped them develop a whole business plan and a roadmap, and they're committed. The problem is that their existing fuels are so cheap because they have subsidized them for years. And so they're in a similar subsidy trap where, trying to move to that new regime, and they can see that if they have abundant renewable energy and if they have abundant electrical vehicles, that it's a better place to be. But how do you get from here to there? So that becomes our challenge, is really helping them. How do you get from here to there? It's not an easy path. So trying to avoid future subsidy caps definitely be something we're focused on.
If I can add on to that, one of the things that we saw when we participated, we were engaging institutional investors, those that are providing concessionary capital, commercial investors. The main thing that the consensus that we got from the concessionary capital providers is that they want a pathway to phase out the concessionary capital. So when you are designing whatever project it is that you're designing, you need commercial capital also at the table. They need to buy into the projects that you're designing. So there's a pathway to then phase out the grants, the concessions. They need to be more catalytic in nature, and so the projects don't become reliant on subsidies or discounts. They can eventually just sustain themselves. And also so we don't crowd out commercial investors. We need them at the table. Yeah.
Well, commercial investor issues reminds me of something that I'll ask about just after, reminding everybody to use Slido if you have any Q&A, because we are going to turn to audience Q&A in maybe 5-10 minutes. So if you have any questions, please go on to Slido. Again, the QR code there in the bottom right, or you can go to slido.com and the word affordability. You put that in, and I'll come to this panel. So you mentioned commercial investments as well. There are a lot of different stakeholders that you all have to work with and I'm sure that it varies country to country. That I think is sort of maybe an underappreciated challenge of getting some of these policies in place and some of these transitions happening. Can you discuss some of the strategies you use to bring together diverse coalitions to sort of ultimately end up with policies that will, help the people's ability to pay, help deploy clean energy? Maybe Anna, do you want to start?
Happy to start. So I talked at the beginning about the need for smart policies that are going to deploy efficient and affordable appliances. And I think key to that is bringing other stakeholders that can scale adoption of appliances as well. So it's great to have, policy that has been established by a government. Then how do we bring adoption of these appliances as a scale? And this is where state agencies, utilities, and other organizations that have purchase power can come in as well. And we have seen this very effectively in many economies. I'm thinking in Pakistan, for instance, we're working with a provincial authority that is using an endorsement label to promote more efficient appliances, to guide procurement of more efficient appliances as well, building on the national government. In India as well, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency has a very comprehensive program, and the state agencies are now building on that program by doing bulk buys, by doing replacement programs as well, so that, we bring economies of scale and we can reduce the cost of appliances. So I think that's a great way of building on national policy, engaging other stakeholders that have large portions of power to create economies of scale and bring costs down of appliances, increasing affordability, of course.
I might try. example. There we go. Similar example that I think is a really good example, a tool I'm on, just a tool that can be applied to a lot of sectors, and it's a similar idea. So it may seem like we're not bringing stakeholders together, but ultimately we are, because what we really want is for governments to commit to, again, investing in public transportation, and for us, electric transportation is that kind of bullseye of affordability, sweet spot in climate change. But how do we bring down the prices? We also want countries to commit to only electric vehicles. We want companies to only commit to electric vehicles. But how do we get them on board? Local auto manufacturing is often a very big, important part of an economy and job creation. So getting auto manufacturers to agree is really challenging, to go from producing conventional vehicles or selling conventional vehicles to. And one way that we are addressing that is through scale. And I think scale is the solution no matter what sector you're talking about. And for us, that means making a lot more electric buses so that the price of those buses can come down. And what we're seeing different countries do, which is a similar idea, is pooled procurement. So if one city goes to buy electric buses, every bus, a city might make a purchase of 100 buses, those 100 expensive. But if instead a country can pull the demand across the country, then you're not only demanding or making 100 buses, you're making 1,000 buses or 10,000 buses, and that allows the prices. Not sure. That allows the prices to come down both on the supply side and the demand side. So we're seeing countries like India have these huge full procurement programs that then are subsidized by the government. They're backed up by policy in the government. And we're seeing that kind of model replicated around the world. Brazil is another country now where we helped not only the government of Brazil, but the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Cities, the manufacturers, the National Development Bank, and now the World Bank come in to develop a program where we helped look at the demand of 21 cities across the country. Just a few years ago, these cities did not want e-buses. Through our pilot projects, they've now been convinced that they're a good thing. 21 cities, now 14,000 e-buses are being supported to the government, and that fuels the manufacturing of the government of the country, and then they get on board. So it's kind of a full circle affordability, and of course that brings down the cost worldwide as well.
From our side, I think, in looking. In looking at stakeholder engagement, I think reflecting on publicly driven clean energy programs like we have here in the US, it is if you are relying on ratepayer funding or public money to fund your programs, you have no way around stakeholder engagement. The question is just really how robust that stakeholder engagement is. And the lessons there have also been around, don't spend too much time consulting only with subject matter experts, that you forget to spend time engaging your day-to-day consumers. Because, and this is why it's also important to leverage community outreach organizations that can help frame the dialogue appropriately. And get input from your day-to-day consumers. What we've seen also is, program designers are spending a lot of time thinking very thoughtfully about deep electrification, designing these programs and these incentives. And, a couple of months, once the program is out of the door, the adoption rate of the programs are really, really low or really, really poor. Because the feedback that they're now getting is that the gap in the market there's a significant gap to the market even before consumers access these benefits. Consumers more are focused on weatherization. They need help with health and safety of their buildings. So you almost have to go back to the drawing board and look at how you're doing stakeholder engagement then. In South Africa or Africa as a continent where government really hasn't gotten too much behind a lot of these clean energy incentives, and so they are very much organizationally driven. there it has been up to us as, project developers, funds to sort of think creatively about shared value and finding organizations that we can collaborate with. So with our fund, like I mentioned, we are working with our technology and EPC entity, who is sitting and helping us actually mine the utility data that we've received from the landlords, and helping us draw very useful insights that we can then, take to capital providers and share a story that actually demystifies the perceptions around risk for the sector. So that becomes very critical, and then also it becomes critical in engaging organizations like the GBPN to help us also lobby for government for more targeted program incentives to help support some of the initiatives that we're doing. So it becomes very key.
Do you have anything on this, Kevin? Okay. That reminds me of during the Recovery Act in the United States after the 2008 sort of housing crisis. There was all these programs to give zero interest loans to households to do household retrofits, and nobody took them because no one wanted to take out money even at 0% interest, and it just wasn't well understood until after that program was offered. Maybe we'll turn to some of the questions from the audience. There's a question along the stakeholder theme of what is the role of utilities as a trusted consumer-facing entity. I'm not sure everybody trusts their utility, but okay, well, we'll let that pass. As a trusted consumer-facing entity in enabling demand response, energy efficiency, and managed EV charging, among other things.
Shall I take that one? Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different colours of utility in the world. And I think, my bias here, so I always find it quite strange being a Brit in the US and advocating for markets, or a European, I should say, but I really believe in the power of, as you probably already understood, like price signals and markets to drive demand response. I don't think we can get it from people individually turning up and down their thermostats at scale. And I'm not convinced that utilities, necessarily have an interest if they're in a sort of CapEx plus model to really, be at the forefront of demand response and energy efficiency. Of course, you can incentivize it in different ways. And of course, we've got many great energy efficiency programs in lots of different countries where, utilities are regulated to drive, to enable and support energy efficiency retrofits. But I think when we're talking about the real frontier of markets, of demand response and getting that real flexibility in the system, I think it's the innovators, the digital innovators that are going to do it at scale, or that are doing it at scale, the octopuses of this world that can, aggregate huge numbers of small scale resources, demand side resources, using, data and, in order to try to, balance the system. That's, where the real power is going to come from. It's not going to come from your, sort of an old school vertically integrated utility kind of helping people shift their thermostats up and down during the day. So I think that's a bit of a question as to, in my mind, as to whether, we've always, I think at RAP, sort of been quite agnostic about market design, whether public ownership of utilities, but I think it's going to be really difficult to get the flexibility working without, having somehow retail customers not necessarily directly exposed to wholesale pricing, but you need to get that kind of marginal pricing, whether it's the time of use pricing or the locational price signals. You need that in order to get the flexibility into the system, would be my answer to that.
I think if I can just reflect on that question, the utilities here in New York are the ones that are actually funding a lot of the work that the clean energy programs that are being designed by NYSERDA. So that's a good partnership and a good source of a good use of the funds that are coming from the utilities. A percentage of their revenues go towards the work that NYSERDA is doing. On the African continent, because we only have really one national utility, for example, in South Africa, so that utility markets have only just recently been deregulated. The role that they play there, it's more around really helping to actually provide, you have to register all your projects with the utility. So they are sort of like the gatekeepers now of private small-scale embedded projects. They have to, the grid access requirements really have to pass that utility check. Utilities are the ones who are approving these types of projects. Because they are the ones who are in control of the grid in their regions. So working with them to actually, they need to sort of standardize their infrastructure because different municipalities have different sort of standards, so sort of standardizing that. So it's easy to then get more and more projects scaled across the country.
Just to add, utilities can serve as aggregators as well. So we talk about the need for those large buyers that can scale adoption. I think there are examples where utilities have the mandate for energy efficiency programs that have been very successful in doing that. But sometimes it also serves utilities, and I'm thinking the example in Brazil, where many of the favelas don't have formal access to electricity, and actually they're not paying for it. So utilities have run very successful replacement programs to bring more efficient products to the favelas, because that's going to reduce that loss, electricity loss. But again, very successful in bringing, in this case, was refrigerators that were affordable and that are improving the income and the livelihood of these households.
Yeah, actually, speaking of utilities as aggregators, one of the other questions here is on 2- and 3-wheel vehicles, and whether that's a missed, or to what extent that's a missed opportunity. I don't know if you'd say it's a missed opportunity, Heather, but the role of 2-wheel EVs in the Global South for household savings and home charging.
Let's see if I get lucky this time. Well, it's not an opportunity because we are working on it, and many organizations are working on it. And electrifying 2-wheelers is very important. At ITDP, we have a lot of healthy debate about 2-wheelers. 2-wheelers are certainly more efficient in the fact that they use a lot less fuel, and ideally if they're electric, then that's a really efficient way to get around. However, it's a really dangerous way to get around. 2-wheelers in specifically are a huge cause of injuries and road fatalities. And at ITDP, we see that there's a huge growth in 2-wheelers, especially in Asia and Africa, but now even in Latin America. And we really see that as a failure of investment in public transportation systems. People are using 2-wheelers because they don't have affordable alternatives. And again, I should have said this more clearly earlier. People can't afford cars. That's why they're walking and taking buses. But I think at this point it's somewhat inevitable, unfortunately, and so making sure that 2-wheelers are electric is very important, and then also designing road space so that there is a safe way for 2-wheelers to get around, and they're not just trying to fit into a vehicle-oriented world will make them better. But certainly electrifying 2-wheelers is a huge thing, and there again, often the cost incentives work, so it's really about getting people the upfront financing that they need to afford those vehicles. But there is a lot of effort to move to 2-wheelers.
Great. There's one more question. I think we'll end with this one. So how can we spearhead bottom-up energy development led by and for communities in the Global South, better centering community needs and direct participation? That's some already, but if anyone has anything additional to add.
I'd just say one thing really, which is, given time short, which is just to show them what's happening in Pakistan, because it's just so exciting. Governments have failed to build out grids and electricity systems for people in many Global South countries, but the overcapacity and massive drop in solar panel prices is just driving a complete revolution in behind the meter generation that is just unbelievable. And I think it's going to be really exciting seeing what the impact of that is on how electricity markets work when the majority of the generation isn't even on the grid anymore. So I think it doesn't really require orchestration, it seems.
I also think that, in the global south, you really can't design and introduce these technologies with actually understanding what their household adoption for these technologies will be. You are designing in a vacuum. So a lot of it has to do with going out and doing stakeholder engagement as you're designing and trying to introduce these projects, demand creation as well. So that's why our fund is really focusing on technical assistance, and part of it is really working with households to help them understand the importance of climate resilience, so they can understand why we are trying to introduce these technologies into their households. But also it's looking at how we incorporate communities in the value chain for the projects that we are structuring, and the opportunities, giving them an opportunity to also participate as part of the green workforce helps to create a lot of engagement and uptake for these initiatives.
I think for us, this means especially increasing participation of civil society and consumer advocates in the policymaking process. And we're seeing an increase of this in many economies where the process now is more open and transparent, but definitely there is a higher effort needed in increasing that participation and facilitating that participation of consumer advocates in policymaking.
That's great. Well, I think with that, we will leave it there. What is affordable is a free drink, which you can have right after this conversation. So please join me hopefully there, and as well as in thanking the panel here. Thank you all for your attention as well.